Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Novel of the Century, The Extraordinary Adventure of Les Misérables, by David Bellos. Narrated by David Bellos. Author's Note on reading Les Misérables. A lot of people come across the stories of Fantine, Cosette, the Thénardier, Valjean, Javert, Marius, and Gavroche in some form or another when they are young. I don't know why, but I wasn't part of the crowd, and I didn't encounter Les Misérables until much later on, in circumstances that aren't very creditable in the life of a professor of French. I was actually looking for a light but long book to take with me on a hike to read by lamplight in the tent, and a one-volume edition of Hugo's novel, printed on Bible paper, sitting unread on my shelf, struck me as having the highest reading-to-weight ratio in the universe. I slipped it into a little bag and took it along. The camping trip on a long-distance trail in the Alps turned out to be a disaster. It rained and it snowed. I caught a cold and then gave up. We trudged down a mountain path and found a hotel where I wrapped myself in warm blankets and in Les Misérables. I was entranced. I stayed ill rather longer than necessary in order to follow this moving, challenging, and immensely engaging tale to the end. I had never before read a work so extraordinarily diverse, yet so tightly wound round its central thread. Les Misérables may be a monster in size, but there's nothing baggy about it. I don't think I'm allowed to urge you to take sick leave to repeat the experience that I had, nor do I dare suggest you abandon your holiday plans to make time to consume a 1,500-page novel in one gulp. But I doubt you'll regret it if you do. Fortunately, there is a more practical way to enjoy Hugo's novel within a busy life. Les Misérables consists of 5 parts, divided respectively into 8, 15, and 9 books, making 48 in all. Each book consists of a number of chapters, varying from none at all, that's the case of Part 5, Book 4, designated 5-4, which counts as a chapter in itself, to 22, in the case of 3-8, the longest book, which ends with the dramatic denouement of the ambush at 50-52 Boulevard de l'Hôpital. The divisions weren't made until the final preparation of the manuscript for printing in the winter of 1861-2, and Hugo never let on, or perhaps never consciously registered, what the underlying numerical design of his book was. But the fact is that Les Misérables is made of exactly 365 chapters. You can therefore read 1 chapter a day, most of them are quite short, and complete Hugo's vast novel of love and revolution in the time that it takes planet Earth to complete its revolution around the sun. Everything in a work of art is an act of the will, Hugo wrote in an introduction to his own son's translation of Shakespeare into French. What makes Les Misérables such an amazing work of art is that despite its length, its complexity, and its vast scope, every detail and every dimension, even if not made explicit, was designed, calculated, and decided by the author. 19th century France was a turbulent and frequently violent place, but it was also uncommonly generous to the rest of the world. From the Revolution of 1789 to the dawn of the 20th century, it gave away many treasures for free: the rights of man, decimal currency, knowledge of hieroglyphics, photography, cinema, the Statue of Liberty, pasteurized milk. The list could go on and on. Its painters and composers set new standards that we still admire, and its writers still dominate our ideas of what poetry and fiction can be. But among all the gifts France has given to Hollywood, Broadway, and the common reader wherever she may be, Les Misérables stands out as the greatest by far. This reconstruction of how this extraordinary novel arose, how it was published, what it means and what it has become, is my way of saying thank you to France. Translations and references. There are many translations into English of Victor Hugo's novel, done in different countries at different times. In this book, quotations from Les Misérables are taken from the most recent translation by Christine Donnerer, published by Penguin Books in 2013, with occasional adaptations of my own which are signalled when they arise. Translations of other sources quoted are my own unless otherwise indicated. Introduction. The Journey of Les Misérables. The Commodore Clipper, a 14,000-ton roll-on, roll-off ferry, leaves Portsmouth early in the morning, glides through the naval dockyards at walking pace, gathers speed as the Isle of Wight passes on the starboard side, and reaches 22 knots in the open waters of the English Channel. The swell can toss small boats up and down, but the ferry's stabilizers deceive you into thinking the sea is made of rippled gelatine. Before long, the westernmost tip of the Cotentin Peninsula comes into view. Then the ship clears Cap de la Hague to port, heads for the low bar of Sark, and after skirting round Herm and picking its way among jagged rocks breaking the surface of a blue-green sea, enters the harbour of St. Peter Port on the island of Guernsey. The countryside around it is lush and green. The first daffodils bloom before January is out. Victor Hugo landed here at around 10 in the morning of the 31st of October, 1855, after a shorter but rougher crossing in wind and rain on a 300-ton paddle steamer from St. Helier in Jersey. But even the tiny Courrier was too big to dock at St. Peter Port in those days. The poet and his party had to clamber down ladders into small boats to be rowed ashore. Dock hands took care of the baggage, including the all-important manuscript trunk. Anyone landing in much greater comfort and safety on the Commodore Clipper nowadays sees much the same quaint townscape as Hugo did. It's only a short walk from the new harbour to the steps up to High Street, and from there the same lane takes you to Hauteville Street, lined with three-storey townhouses built in the earlier part of the 19th century. Halfway up is a large, plain, double-fronted mansion now marked by a tricolour flag and a nameplate declaring it to be the property of the city of Paris and the Maison de Victor Hugo. That's because Hauteville House at St. Peter Port, Guernsey, is the unlikely location where the most extraordinary novel ever written in French was made. How did a tiny feudal outpost of the British Crown come to serve as the workbench for a vast panorama of 19th century France? There's barely a word that refers to the Channel Islands in all of Les Misérables, yet it is hard to imagine how it could have been brought to completion without the sanctuary provided by Hauteville House. The story of the long-drawn-out composition of this very long book is almost as dramatic as the story it tells. Victor Hugo didn't land on Guernsey in 1855 in search of a comfortable writer's retreat, but because he had nowhere else to go. Despite his celebrity status on the European stage, he was a migrant and a refugee, in the language of the day, a proscrit. Les Misérables is a novel of the poor, the downtrodden, and the outcast. It was expanded on Guernsey from a draft into a masterpiece by a man who was an outcast himself. From the day of its publication, on the 4th of April 1862, Les Misérables has remained at the forefront of bestseller lists the world over. It has been read in French and in hundreds of translations by millions of people in any country you care to name. It was turned into a play within weeks and has been adapted for radio and the cinema screen over the last century and a half, more than any other literary work. But the unique adventure of Les Misérables as a global cultural resource did not come about by chance. From his roof terrace, with its wonderful view of Sark and the sea, Victor Hugo always intended his great work to speak far beyond the borders of France and beyond the pages of a book. Most plans to conquer the whole world with a story go awry. Les Misérables is a wonderful exception. But the popularity of the story and of the characters Hugo created and their frequent reuse in mass-market entertainments have had a depressing effect on attitudes towards his book. Judging Les Misérables by the sometimes inept adaptations of it in comic strips, cartoons, and stage musicals, serious readers have often turned up their noses at a work they assume to fall below the level of great art. It's not a scientific survey, but I think it's significant that a higher proportion of baristas and office staff than literature professors I've met have read Les Misérables from end to end. However, the modern division of literary and popular fiction had hardly been invented when Hugo wrote it. "I do not know whether it will be read by all," he told the publisher of the Italian translation, "but I wrote it for everyone." It did not occur to him that a masterpiece could not be a blockbuster too, and he saw no reason why everyone should not be served the same fare as literary connoisseurs. To have done anything less would have been contrary to the moral and political aims of his book. Les Misérables is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, Fantine, focuses on an abandoned single mother who loses her job and falls into prostitution, a brush with the law, and an early death. Part 2, Cosette, foregrounds Fantine's daughter, who is cruelly exploited by foster parents and then rescued by the novel's hero, who brings her up to become a young lady. Part 3, Marius, features a middle-class student who joins a group of political idealists and fights with them in a failed attempt to overthrow the monarchy. Part 4, the idyll of Rue Plumet and the epic of Rue Saint-Denis, alternates between the love affair of Cosette and Marius that blossoms in the garden of a house in Rue Plumet and the student's barricade in a small street off Rue Saint-Denis in the heart of old Paris. Part 5 is entitled Jean Valjean, after the ex-convict whose life story from the age of 45 to his death 20 years later is the narrative backbone of the novel. Valjean's life before 1815 is told in a few paragraphs. A sturdy, uneducated peasant from Faverolles, a village in Brie to the east of Paris, he's sentenced to hard labour in his mid-20s for stealing a loaf of bread. He emerges from prison after 19 years inside, and the novel really begins with his release a few weeks after the Battle of Waterloo. Rejected by innkeepers in a small town on his route north from Toulon, because he is an ex-convict, Valjean is offered hospitality by the local bishop, Monseigneur Myriel. He is overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of the priest, and he resolves to become a better man. Valjean uses the bishop's charitable gift to go into business under the assumed name of Monsieur Madeleine at Montreuil-sur-Mer, a small town on the Channel coast. He makes a fortune earns respect, and is pressed into accepting the position of mayor. That is where he encounters Fantine. Fantine's backstory is more extended. A child of the streets from Montreuil-sur-Mer, she goes to Paris to find work, and then becomes the lover of a heartless student, Tholomyès, with whom she has a child. In 1817, he abandons her without a penny. She returns to her hometown because she has heard there are jobs to be had, leaving her child to be fostered by the Thénardier, innkeepers she comes across at the village of Montfermeil. All the place names are real and can be found on a map of France. Fantine has a few months of relative comfort in her factory job, but she is sacked when her supervisor discovers she has an illegitimate child. She tries to survive on sewing, but when piecework rates sink, she has no choice but to go on the streets. One winter's night, she is accosted by a middle-class lout called Bamatabois. She fights back and is arrested by the local police chief, Javert. Mayor Madeleine, that is to say Jean Valjean, intervenes to save her from a prison sentence. When he learns that her plight is the indirect result of his own factory's policy, he promises to look after her child. At Montreuil, Javert, who had formerly worked as a prison guard, suspects he has seen the mayor before, and is even more suspicious when Madeleine displays formidable strength in rescuing a local carter, Fauchelevent, from under his overturned wagon. These suspicions as to the true identity of the taciturn factory boss are swept away when a vagrant, arrested for stealing an apple tree branch, is identified as the missing ex-convict Valjean. Madeleine now faces a terrible choice: to let the vagrant take the rap or to give himself up. After a night of soul-searching, he bursts into the courthouse in Arras and declares his true identity. He is sent back to the hard-labour jail in Toulon for life. He makes a daring escape, recovers the savings he had put in a buried chest. He persuades the Thénardier to let him take Cosette away from their brutal care, and settles in a quiet corner of Paris, where he brings her up as his daughter, she never learns his real name, and calls him father. He lives modestly, but in emulation of the good bishop who had transformed his moral perspective, he never fails to give alms to the poor. Rumors about the existence of a rich pauper in the area reach the ears of the newly appointed chief detective, none other than Javert, promoted from his previous position at Montreuil-sur-Mer. Javert sets a trap and nearly catches Valjean, who escapes the dragnet by climbing over a high wall and hoisting up Cosette after him. Valjean and Cosette don't know where they are in the dark, but suddenly a man recognizes them. It is Fauchelevent, now working as a gardener in the convent of the Perpetual Adoration. He is the only man tolerated in this all-female cloister, but out of gratitude for the former mayor who had saved his life, he takes on Valjean as assistant gardener, claiming him as his younger brother ultime. Cosette is admitted to the convent school, where she is given a regular education. The pair live on in their impenetrable sanctuary for 5 years, and leave it only when Cosette has turned from a girl into a beautiful young woman. Valjean then rents a well-hidden house in Rue Plumet. On walks in the Luxembourg Gardens, Cosette is noticed by a handsome student, Marius Pontmercy. Marius's backstory is more elaborate and told at greater length. He is the son of a soldier in Napoleon's army who, while lying wounded after the Battle of Waterloo, was saved, but also robbed, by a camp follower called Thénardier. His mother had died when he was an infant, and his father, constantly absent on military campaigns abroad, had no choice but to let him be cared for by his maternal grandfather, Gillenormand, an aged eccentric who insists on dressing, speaking, and behaving as if the French Revolution never happened. He hands on to Marius his own reactionary and royalist views. But when the young man discovers who his father really was, he becomes a passionate admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte. Marius picks a fight with his grandfather and storms out of the house to live on his own. He is befriended by a group of student activists who call themselves the Friends of the ABC, but he also falls head over heels in love with the girl he has seen in the park. The Thénardiers, meanwhile, have lost their inn and moved to Paris, where they live in the same squalid lodging house where Valjean and Cosette had lived years before, and where Marius now also resides. They use their daughters, Azelma and Éponine, to operate a scam. They hand letters written under false identities to well-off people in the streets, hoping to elicit charitable gifts. Valjean falls for one such approach and agrees to visit the allegedly starving family under one of its many pseudonyms. He takes Cosette along with him so she can experience the practice of giving alms to the needy. The pauper's neighbor, who is none other than Marius, sees his beloved in the room next door through a gap in the wall. After her departure, he also hears the Thénardiers plotting to rob the white-haired gentleman because they reckon he is a millionaire. Marius is in a bind. He has to save Cosette's father from an ambush. But he also realizes that the crook in the next room is the man who saved his own father's life. When Valjean returns to complete his charitable gift, he is tied to a chair and tortured by Thénardier and his sinister gang. Marius has alerted the police to the planned ambush and lets off a warning shot. In the ensuing arrest of the criminals, Valjean, who remains Javert's most wanted prey, escapes yet again. Marius doesn't know who the beautiful young woman he so desires really is, or how to find her again. However, Thénardier's daughter Éponine has a crush on him, as well as contacts in the underworld. She leads Marius to the house in Rue Plumet where Cosette lives. A touching teenage romance ensues through late-night meetings in the lush and secluded garden of the house. Meanwhile, unrest is brewing among the working people of Paris. Riots erupt after the funeral of a well-known Republican general. However, Marius realizes that his grandfather will never allow him to marry Cosette. Worse still, Cosette reports that her father plans to move to England to keep her safe in case the looming strife turns into a violent revolution. In lovelorn despair, Marius throws in his lot with his student friends and goes to get himself killed on a barricade. Valjean intercepts the correspondence between the two lovers and decides that however much it pains him to lose his adopted daughter, he has a duty to save the life of the man she loves. He sets off to bring Marius back from the barricade. At the doomed barricade, the last one standing with no wider support, the students' leader makes an impassioned speech about their cause, and then government troops begin their assault. Javert, who has infiltrated the revolutionary group as a police spy, is unmasked and condemned to death. The task of execution is entrusted to Valjean, but instead of shooting his persistent pursuer, he lets him go free. The policeman can't understand the generosity of a man he can only see as criminal scum. With his world turned upside down, he throws himself into the Seine. Marius is badly wounded in the Battle of the Barricade, and there is no easy escape from the army and the police who now control the city. Valjean puts Marius over his shoulder and clambers down a manhole into a sewer. The terrifying trudge through the putrid tunnels beneath the city is the most dramatic and biblical episode in Valjean's long story of redemption. Marius recovers from his injuries. His grandfather accepts him back into the family home and gives his blessing to his marrying Cosette. She brings her husband a handsome dowry provided by her father from the money he had saved from his business career and kept safe in a hole in the ground for 10 years. Valjean's story is almost over. His last trial is to decide whether to reveal his true identity to Marius or to live as an anonymous hanger-on in what is now a respectable middle-class home. He chooses to reveal who he really is and to withdraw into a monkish existence in a small apartment of his own. Within a couple of years, his health fails and he fades away. The novel ends in 1835 with his burial in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise. The epitaph on his gravestone has now been erased by wind and rain. The overall shape of the story of Les Misérables fits a pattern familiar from novels of all ages, but especially of its own period. Madame Bovary of 1857, for example, also tells a life story from near the beginning to the end. Great Expectations of 1861 spends more time on the early years of Pip's life and less on its later decades, but it's designed in the same general way, on a thread of chronology wound round a central character. Crime and Punishment of 1866, on the other hand, doesn't tell us much about Raskolnikov's childhood and upbringing, but it follows him through from his crime to his redemption in Siberia decades later. As a life story novel, Les Misérables is a characteristic work of its time. It also has in common with other novels of the period. War and Peace appeared between 1863 and 1868, and Moby Dick appeared in 1851, the fact that its main story could have been told in a much, much shorter book. But none of these great works aimed to tell a story and nothing more. And Hugo aimed to do almost everything it was possible to do in novel form. Like Tolstoy, he includes essays on the meaning of historical events, though none so disappointing as the last chapter of War and Peace. Like Dostoevsky, he shares with us the drama of the soul. Like Dickens, he wants to show us all of what it means to be poor. The summary of the story of Les Misérables is like a path through a forest, but the forest is as much the subject of the novel as the path. The path is nonetheless the way forward. It leads from a small crime and disproportionate punishment to conversion and then adherence to a demanding concept of righteous conduct. Valjean is not a complicated, mixed, self-critical or tragic hero to put alongside Raskolnikov or Ivan Karamazov. In a sense, he's not a novelistic character at all. He's not a saint either, but the model of a new man. Valjean does not represent directly any particular political or religious position. What he models is the potential that the poorest and most wretched have to become worthy citizens. His repeated victories over physical, moral, and emotional obstacles make him a hero, of course, but they also assert, against the attitudes prevalent at that time, that moral progress is possible for all in every social sphere. After his conversion, Valjean is a generous and charitable man, and his epic struggle is to abide by the commandment to be kind, even when tempted by anger, resentment, jealousy, and revenge. Through the character of Jean Valjean, Les Misérables gives
Sample complete. Ready to continue?